Great, well, thank you. I apologize in advance that I think that many of you have the faulty expectation that this is going to be an uplifting talk. And see, already a joke, people laughing. Hopefully that'll diminish soon enough, though. So I appreciate being able to share with you this topic. In large part, I think it's an important topic. I think that this has a lot of implications for issues dealing with public health, social relations, but also in terms of career selection, retirement, and basically how we live our lives. Typically, my belief is that we use something like happiness as the guideline for everything else that we do. So oftentimes we think, should I do this? The follow-up question being, well, is it going to make me happy? And that will be the determinant if we should go on and do that thing. So I think that we should spend some time asking why we should actually care about the nature of happiness. So that'll be my first part there. The second component will be looking at whether or not our understanding of happiness could use some refinement and asking if there's maybe a better account of happiness, if not a correct one. I'll then look at the relationship between happiness and pleasure itself, spending time in asking the question, well, what is pleasure? And hopefully getting some clarification there. And then maybe answering this question, is it possible to have happiness without pleasure itself? And then I'll look at some additional considerations, maybe anticipate some objections. I do ask that you don't throw anything at me if you're upset by anything I happen to say. But little hand gestures are sufficient, and I'll take that as a cue for future discussion. All right, so first question being, why should we care about happiness? My assumption is that we actually do care about happiness, that we actually want to be happy. In large part, looking at the choices that we make, we choose a particular career path and thinking that if I do this career, then I'll be successful. By being successful, then I can have a happy life. And the friends that we choose to be with, we typically want to be around others who will make us happy, or in engaging in activities with them, we'll then be happier. The hobbies that we choose, musical instruments, art, and so on, we typically identify them as being things that will contribute to our happiness. If we select one diet over another in terms of maybe being healthy, we think that health is something that will contribute to our happiness. Or if we enjoy maybe not so healthy foods, we typically indulge in them because we think that that pleasure is something that will give us happiness. So that donut, hamburger, and so on. And then also purchasing items, we typically purchase a shiny car, fancy dress or whatever, jewelry or game, movies, because we think that in purchasing it, it will further contribute to our happiness. We very rarely choose something because we think that's going to make us unhappy. I don't think I've come across anyone who said, I'm doing this because it will make me unhappy. It's generally, I'm doing this because it will make me happy. So I think that we want to be happy, and since we want it, we should probably figure out what it is. And this is something that Aristotle, so dead guy, long time ago, had come up with this understanding of happiness from his book on ethics called the Nicomachean Ethics. For happiness, we choose always for itself and never for the sake of something else. But honor, pleasure, reason, and ever virtue, we choose indeed for themselves, but we choose them also for the sake of happiness, judging that through them we shall be happy. Happiness, on the other hand, no one chooses for the sake of these, nor in general for anything other than itself. So let's unpack that briefly for a moment. So Aristotle's point here is that we pursue happiness for its own sake, that we look at happiness as the end result of our various actions and decisions. So if we pursue something for the purpose of getting honor, we want honor because we think that in receiving gratitude from others or accolades, that's going to contribute to our happiness. We think then that also in engaging in pleasurable activities, the end result will be happiness. Similarly, by cultivating a better sense of reasoning, that we'll become happier being able to make our own decisions more freely and being in control of our autonomy. And then living a virtuous life, we do so for the sake of living a happy life. But we don't become happy for really any other reason itself. That happiness seems to be the end goal of most of our actions. So we should get a little bit clearer then on why we should care about this topic, seeing how oftentimes we pursue it. So unfortunately, we seem to be on the decline of becoming happier. So this is a report put out by the Center for Disease Control just last year, indicating the rate of suicide, depression, and so on increasing. This is a particular map about suicide rates. So if you look here at Arizona, we've had an increase of 6 to 18% within the past 3 years. And various areas around the country itself, we see significant increases, all the way up to 58% increase in suicide rates. The only place that there's a decrease was 1% in Nevada. Okay? I'm not going to speculate as to why Nevada as opposed to others, but I think that this is an important thing that we should be understanding, is that this is a public health concern. It's a public health issue, and saying that we're doing a pretty bad job of being happy. And then there's also rates indicating that the prescribing of antidepressants have gone up and so on. So we can ask, why might this be happening? Well, one thing too is I think that if there's any career advisors here, this is probably an important slide for you. This is part of the CDC report, but this is from the Registered Nursing website. This is a list of careers and jobs and the suicide rates correlated to those particular jobs themselves. So the number one is construction and extraction. So extraction fields are things like mining in particular, and looking at how these fields where there's really no sense of individuality, that the person is really just a tool to go on to produce a building, to construct this thing, or to just extract things, that in a lot of ways their sense of humanity has been stripped away and their understanding of their personal values are gone, such that they only see themselves as that tool that wakes up, goes to work, creates this thing for something else, for some other purpose, go home, Netflix, whatever, and then repeat. So their quality of life has been greatly diminished, in large part tied to that particular industry. So we see, Heather, so we see a 52% rate of the suicide numbers there. Next up is installation, maintenance, and repair. So again, think about these professions in which individuals are merely just tools for something else, purely service. Interestingly, arts, design, entertainment, sports, and medicine, media, have been tied as number 3. In large part, again, just thinking of themselves as an object, stripping away that individual's humanity. Interestingly, at the very bottom with 5%, education, training, and library. So good job. All right. But why? Think about the opportunity to really explore and to develop yourselves, but to also help others discover and contribute to themselves too. So we have to kind of think about, how can we become happier? Well, in large part, what career we choose is going to have a deep implication for the way that we assess our own lives. We also see here that we've become less happy with our technological advancements and our access to things like social media. So again, this is this one's not from the Center for Disease Control. This one is from the World Happiness Report that's tied to the United Nations. And they just came out with their 2019 numbers, and I'll share those later on. But what we see here then is a correlation between the time spent on the internet as well as the decrease in overall happiness itself too. And you can actually look at the reports to get a sense of how the statistics are run. But what we see here is with more internet hours, that diminishment in sleep, diminishment in in-person social interaction, and happiness as well. These are distinctions between 8th graders, 10th graders, and 12th graders that we see here about 2001, this slope. And what's happened there is more access to technology and online platforms and environments. So it seems that we've become less happy because of our career choices, pursuing careers solely for money's sake, as well as our access to things like social media and internet communities, that we're disconnected from each other. That's really the point here, is that the less frequently that we're engaged with others in meaningful projects, and the more time that we're spending on just screens and interacting with just avatars of each other, then the lower the quality of our lives happen to be. All right? So that's just kind of the empirical data as to why we should talk about this. And so I would actually want to argue is that we've been pursuing pleasure as a primary means to obtaining happiness. And in thinking that pleasure is the best means to obtaining happiness, we actually see that we've been really bad at being happy. So why pleasure in this case? Well, with our social media devices, they've shown that each time that you look at your phone, you get a little spike of dopamine. So you actually have this neurochemical response to hearing that little ping on your phone, social media interactions. So in a lot of ways, it's an addiction that's then cultivating these other desires. Similarly, with a lot of these professions that are at the higher levels for risk of suicide, typically the only means for pursuing those fields is for the money. The thought then is that the money can purchase you, things that are pleasurable. I mean, anyone who's worked construction knows it's miserable. Anyone who's done mining knows it's miserable. These are not, feel-good jobs. They're appreciated, but we have to recognize what impact we're having on those workers themselves. So I want to say here that we've maybe been going about it the wrong way in obtaining happiness, and I don't think that pleasure is going to be the best route. So then let's ask then, what should we think of in terms of happiness, if not just the pleasure itself? Here I'm summarizing from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. It's just an online source. So if you're ever curious about any of the philosophical terms I'm using, you can easily go to plato.stanford.edu, type in any philosophical entry that you're curious about, and there's probably more materials than you'd ever care to have access to. But from the entry on happiness, philosophers generally distinguish between two different types of happiness, one being a value concept and the other one being descriptive. The value concept is when you're looking at how your life is going overall, how you're valuing your life. So this is in terms of well-being or flourishment. There's also the descriptive kind, which is more of a psychological state about how do you actually feel. So we want to distinguish between the quality of one's life from how they actually feel about their life. There's going to be two different accounts of happiness. So we'll play around with this for a little bit. On the psychological views of happiness, there's three main contenders. We have the hedonic view, or hedonism, which essentially states that happiness is directly correlated to the individual's balance of pleasant over unpleasant experiences. That's generally what most people think of when they think of happiness. How do I feel about this? Well, if I have generally more better experiences than negative experiences, then I'm happy. There's also the life satisfaction view that say you've accomplished a whole bunch of things, you might feel a particular way about your life. So for those who are going through a degree granting program, that once you finish that degree, you probably have a sense of gratification, and you can look back at your life with a degree of satisfaction. And the degree to which you are satisfied with your life, in some sense then, is the degree to which you're happy as well. There's also then the emotional state view, which essentially says that how your overall emotional conditions are indicators of your happiness. Now, this does not mean that the individual is aware of that happiness either. It's more so about emotional conditions. And so what I'm going to end up doing actually is saying that from the psychological view, we should probably go along with the emotional state view. And so I'll explain a little bit more about that. So when looking at the hedonic view, we have to ask what actually makes an experience pleasant or unpleasant. So if you've ever maybe engaged in a workout program of some kind, starting out to working out, it's not pleasant by any means. But you get to some point later on where working out is maybe something that you absolutely have to do, that it becomes pleasurable over time. But if you were to adopt this view and just say that your happiness is going to be tied to having pleasant over unpleasant experiences, and you try working out that first day, you're saying, no, that's entirely unpleasant, I should not do that because I want to be happy, you're going to spend more time with Netflix and so on. Okay? So that's one risk. Also, thinking about with children. Children probably don't enjoy doing things that are actually good for them in the long run. But yet we tell them, keep at it, keep going, keep trying this thing. So we're, most of the time, not very good at assessing what counts as a pleasurable experience or what's an unpleasant one. So for that reason, I don't want to hold on to the hedonic view. I think there's intrinsic problems there. Similarly, with the life satisfaction view, by looking at your subjective evaluation of how your life has gone, it may be on the wrong track. So let's say that you're a thief, and you think that my life satisfaction is going to be contingent upon my capacity to steal many things. They look back at all the things that they've stolen, and they might feel very satisfied with that. Is that then going to be the best sort of life that that individual should be living if we think that people should be living happy lives? That person's certainly satisfied with what they've accomplished, but do we want to encourage that kind of satisfaction? So there's still a lot of problems with this view going on. In large part, how do we actually determine if your own life is going well, what are the parameters at play? So this is why I want to maybe advocate for something like the emotional state view, is that your emotional conditions are going to be indicators of your well-being. It's thinking about mental health issues. If you're not depressed, if you're patient, if you're able to sleep, so on, those are going to be reliable indicators that your life is probably going in a healthy direction. So there's close connections then between happiness and health in this case. And we can use mental health as an indicator of your well-being. Okay. We then have these evaluative views. I'm not going to go into too much detail on these, but this is where we think of a happy life as one in which the person is exhibiting well-being, they're flourishing, they're well off, so to speak. We then have two subjectivist views and then one objective view. On the subjectivist accounts, the hedonic view again says that well-being will be tied to our capacity to experience pleasure. But then again, which pleasures are the right sort of pleasures to be having? The desire theory is well-being is tied to the satisfaction of desires itself. But as Buddhists, I think, have correctly acknowledged that the satisfaction of one desire just results in the generation of another desire. So desires breed desires. If you're constantly in a desirous state, then you're probably not going to be content at any point or exhibiting personal satisfaction. But this objectivist theory account states that well-being is going to be tied to the benefits, things that you actually need in order to thrive or flourish, regardless of how you actually feel about it. So there you can tell the child, no, you need to do this in order for your life to go well, even if the student's or the child's complaining about it. Sorry, I'm used to talking about students here. You should do this. This is good for you. That regardless of how they feel about it in that moment, it's still going to be good for them. So even if it's writing 2,000 words a week, trust me, it's good for you. So what I want to do then is allow for something like a hybrid account, is allowing happiness to be tied to this objectivist theory that what it is in being human is going to be tied to actual facts of what's going to make you a good or better human, what's going to allow for you to be better off, in a similar way to how a plant requires sunlight and proper watering to flourish and grow and thrive as a human being, is going to require a particular set of objective conditions as well. And of course we can ask, well, how do we discover those? I'll get to that in a little bit. But I also want us to allow for our emotional conditions to be indicators of how well our life is going. Now, I don't mean here that we should be directly pursuing those emotional feelings for the sake of having a happy life, in large part because then that allows for intoxication, pharmaceuticals, things of that sort, to get you there. Instead, I want to say is that in living a happy life, a side effect will be the right sort of emotional states. So these will be indicators of a life well lived, rather than being the things that you pursue for the sake of living well. So then let's try to think about the nature of pleasure here, now that we have some sense of what I mean by happiness. Again, there's an entire entry on the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy on just the concept of pleasure itself. So again, probably much more than you would ever care to read about pleasure is available there. But some of the takeaways are that if we were to define pleasure, we could think of it as a single, simple feature of an experience that makes experiences good and attractive to the extent that that experience is pleasant. So some things that we might find to be pleasurable, I'm a big food guy, so cake is awesome. That gives me direct pleasure. Roller coasters, I find to be quite pleasurable as well. So I'm also kind of an adrenaline junkie. But what's interesting, though, is when you're in that pleasurable moment, you're actually not aware of the pleasure. It's typically not until the pleasure is done that you're aware that that thing was pleasurable. So think about in riding a roller coaster, that while you're riding the roller coaster, you're in that moment. You're not reflecting on, I think I'm having a good time. No, it's just you're in it. And then when the roller coaster's over, everyone gets off, you're laughing, wow, that was amazing. Similarly with a piece of cake, you're enjoying it, and all of a sudden you realize, wow, that cake is gone. That was very pleasurable. But it's generally not in the moment itself, so it's usually an afterthought. So with that view in mind, people such as Plato, Aristotle, and Epicurus had assessed pleasure as being resulting effects. For Plato, pleasure is tied to the awareness of processes that fulfill a range of needs. So these might be bodily or intellectual needs, but it's through the satisfaction of that need then that we can say that we have obtained something like pleasure. Aristotle thought that pleasure tracks the perfection of our current activities. So Aristotle thought that in order for us to flourish, we should engage in a set of habitual behaviors, but the pleasure itself is a way to just keep track of it. And he had a really robust theory on how to cultivate the right sort of habits, such that even something like working out or studying or writing could itself turn into a pleasurable activity. That's outlined as Nicomachean Ethics. The Epicurean account is a little bit counterintuitive. The formal definition of pleasure for the Epicurean is that pleasure is simply just the absence of displeasure, or the absence of suffering. So it's working more towards a contentment view, that when you're in a pleasurable state, it means that you're free of fear and you're not suffering. They were essentially concerned about how to face our own deaths and recognizing that one of the things that causes most suffering is the fear of our own mortality. And so learning how to become aware and more comfortable with the idea that we are creatures that will die, that can free us up to then have more pleasure in the long run. But the point here then is that maybe we should be thinking of pleasure as a side effect of having done things well, rather than thinking of pleasure as a thing that we should pursue for the sake of living well. So then, what we're moving towards then is a better view of how to have happiness without pleasure itself. Of course, I've done some philosophical tricks here, aiming us to understand pleasure in a particular way and to understand happiness in a particular way, but we have to start somewhere. And I think most of us have intuitions about pleasure or happiness, but when we get the theories out, then we can actually start having arguments. So hopefully I presented some motivation for thinking of this view of happiness as being both objective and subjective. So something we can ask with regards to the objective list theory account is, what sort of things should we pursue for the sake of making our lives better? And on the emotional state view, what sort of emotional states allow a life to in fact be a happy life? We'll explore those two questions now. So in trying to figure out what sort of things we should pursue, we can just look at what's already been done. We don't have to reinvent the wheel here. So I've already mentioned Buddhism briefly, but the Buddhists generally are concerned with not necessarily obtaining happiness in the traditional sense, but making sure that our lives go well, making sure that we have the capacity to flourish. Some of the ways to do that is to acknowledge these four noble truths. The first noble truth being that all life is suffering. So think about the tale of Siddhartha, leaving the palace walls, going out into the town, observing that what is happening in life is a whole lot of bad stuff, a whole lot of suffering. Second noble truth, though, is to ask, where does this suffering actually come from? And realizing that the suffering is a product of desire. And we see that showing up even in our contemporary situation, that when we desire that connection to others through social media, we see that actually our happiness goes down. Why? Because you're constantly desiring things that result in more desire. Desiring a particular job just for the sake of money itself, again, cultivates more desire as well. We saw the suicide rates greatly increasing with these trends. So we have both empirical and historical reasons for thinking that desire is not the best route to becoming a happy individual. So then the question is, well, how do we make ourselves better? And that's the third noble truth, is that the cessation of desire will, reduce suffering. Fourth noble truth is, okay, so how do we go about stopping to desire things? Well, that's the Eightfold Path. And that's where you get discussion about right attitude, right view, right speech, right meditation, a set of practices that help us quench our desires, such that then we reduce the amount of suffering that we experience. And in reducing the amount of suffering that we experience, we then have more opportunities to flourishing. So I'm actually changing the word a little bit of happiness to one of flourishment. And this is actually more closely tied to the original Greek word. The Greek term that figures like Aristotle had used was eudaimonia. eudaimonia is the Greek word that's generally translated as happiness, but it's best translated as flourishing. The literal translation of eudaimonia is pleasant spirit or pleasant demon, more literally. Okay? So in exploring the Four Noble Truths, that might be one path in engaging this flourishing life. We can then also look to the figures that are part of the Stoic school, who had followed Aristotle in a lot of ways, that we should work to cultivate a set of virtues. Virtues are character traits that actually directly contribute to one's flourishing. How do we discover what a virtue is? Aristotle had a technique he referred to as a doctrine of the mean, that you imagine what it's like to have one particular property and ask yourself, what happens if you have too much of it? Or what happens if you have too little of it? And then finding just that kind of sweet spot, and that will be the virtue itself. So one example might be honesty. We think that's a good thing to be honest with each other. So if you have too much honesty, though, then you might be hurtful or too brash. Okay? That becomes a vice, especially to your relationships. So if I were to ask, how does the shirt look? You're going to say, that's awful, what were you thinking? I can't believe that you even left the house. You might think, that's probably not really too good to the relationship. Similarly, if you're not honest at all, then I might not be able to use those as cues or indicators of what I should end up doing. So we can think about the right amount of honesty as being a virtue to that particular relationship. And he has a whole test for them as well. The Stoics, more specifically though, came up with a set of tools and exercises to overcome adversity, in recognizing that there are a lot of things that we can't control in the world. In fact, this is the first main dictum that shows up in Epicurus' handbook, is above all else, first recognize what is in your control and what is not in your control. And this is very similar to the Serenity Prayer as well. But this is much earlier than that. And so in recognizing what's in your control and what's not, then you recognize what you should be stressing about and what you shouldn't be stressing about. If something's not in your control, why worry about it? You're just going to get upset, disturbed. But if something is in your control, then you can ask yourself, what can I actually do? Well, some things that you can actually do is develop better personality traits or character traits that allow for you to be more calm and tranquil. So that way when adversity arises, you'll be more empowered to face those obstacles instead of just succumbing to them. And that sounds like a more flourishing life, one in which you're able to overcome more obstacles than not. That if something bad happens, you don't just crumble. So those are some things that the objective list theorists might come up with, is in saying that things that should be on your list to help you understand how you should live would include these set of exercises, these set of virtues, the extent to which you cultivate those virtues, the better you're able to live a flourishing life there. Then in looking at the emotional state, we can ask, so what sort of emotions might you end up having if you're living a happy life? Well, you're probably going to be more calm, more relaxed. Things are going fine. Things are going as they should go. Causation still works, so yes, people will still maybe be bothersome, but you can't control them. All you can do is control your response, how you react. So a tranquil mind, or being tranquil, that's going to be a good emotional indicator that you're on track for being happy. Similarly with calmness as well. And that's interesting though. Those are very different responses than what we have to pleasure. Depending upon the kind of pleasure, we can have extremes of complete elation, joy, delight, rapture in some sense, or just basic feel good. But those emotions are fleeting. Even when you have that piece of cake that's so amazing, or that sip of coffee, it's really delicious, and I'm really bummed out that I'm out of coffee, but it's all right. That it's out of my control right now, right? It'd be really strange for me to just walk over to the Starbucks and be like, hold on for a moment, I'll be right back. I'm tempted, but I won't. That the pleasure comes and goes. But calmness and tranquility, those are more long-standing. So in thinking about the emotional states that we should be engaged in to saying that our life is a happy one, we should be looking at those things that are in fact more long-standing. Pleasure comes and goes. But the tranquility, calmness, those sort of dispositions, those are more long-lasting, better indicators of your life going well. So what I would want to say then is that we should pursue a life, and including career, that allows us to cultivate the right character traits, in particular the right set of virtues. That will allow us to flourish. Okay, so flourishment here being happiness, exhibiting eudaimonia, and the things that are up to us are the sort of character traits that we want to pursue for ourselves. So what might be some ways of doing this? So I already mentioned Epictetus briefly, but he has other sets of tools. Each morning, asking yourself, what good should I do today? And then setting up a plan for accomplishing that. That's actually a technique that Benjamin Franklin ended up using each morning. He was influenced by the Stoics quite a bit. Epictetus also has a really nice technique for the middle of the day to ask yourself, what would the sage say, or how would the sage judge my current state of being? The sage for the Stoics was Socrates. So what would Socrates do? It's kind of the Stoic phrase. And then in the evening, asking yourself 3 questions. First one being, what went well today? Give yourself a pat on the back. Good job. Okay, you did something right. But that's not really too helpful. Next question being, what went wrong? And then asking yourself, what can you do differently for the next day such that whatever went wrong will not happen again? And if you check in with yourself on a regular basis, you're going to be constantly fine-tuning yourself. And you can do a similar activity for each week. So what went well in the past week, what went wrong, what can I do differently for the next one, each month, and each year as well. And that's kind of a Stoic habit that will help you cultivate the right sort of character traits in recognizing that, okay, maybe I wasn't as honest as I should be. Maybe I wasn't as friendly as I could be. Maybe I wasn't as courageous as I should be. What can you do differently to ensure that you cultivate those set of character traits? And that's the very thing that Benjamin Franklin ended up doing. He has a small book called the Book of Virtues, and he actually constructed a method for 13 particular virtues that you then go through 4 times throughout the year. So each week, you just meditate and focus on a particular virtue. When you've done that, then you go on to the next one down the list and so on. And he has a nice graph on how to kind of mark when you've slighted those virtues. So when's the time that you were maybe not as honest as you should have been? Put a mark there. And the goal then is to have as few of marks by the end of the week, month, and year, and do that periodically. So we can engage in self-reflective practices, and philosophy is really the field about self-reflection. Socrates had suggested that the unexamined life is one that's not worth living. The Oracle of Delphi that he had gone to get the information that he was the wisest person in all of Athens, above it, says to know thyself. So this is part of the philosophical enterprise, is to engage in these self-reflective activities, in large part asking yourself, what's the kind of life that you should be living? And we try to assess this even at a global level. And so this is from the World Happiness Report. I had shown some of the numbers with regards to the relationship between our technology and our happiness levels. So on the right-hand side here, there's a lot more countries on the list, but this is just the top 20 taken to be the happiest countries in the world. And this is the 2019 report of data collected between 2016 and 2018. United States here is down on 19. Beforehand, it was at 14. So we're actually going down. And before that, we were at 11. So we went within 3 iterations of this report, we've gone from 11 to 14 to 19. So what's happening here in our own country? That's something that we should be asking. That's partly why I'm motivated to bring up these issues with you. We then have in the top 5 Nordic countries, Finland, Denmark, Norway, Iceland, and the Netherlands themselves. So how did that happen? So they're giving a poll. This is a Gallup poll, so this is a summary of a Gallup report. They use something called the Caliph ladder. And on this ladder here, you assume that this ladder is a way of picturing your life. The top of the ladder represents the best possible life for you, given your circumstances. The bottom rung of the ladder represents the worst possible life for you. So how much worse could things possibly get? Indicate where on the ladder you feel you personally stand right now, given your social situation, by marking the circle. So top is best possible life, worst possible life down here. And so on average in the US, at least, we've been seeing that people have been entering themselves at a lower rung. So what's happened? Well, interestingly on the report, and you can read this online, I have the website right here for you, worldhappiness.report. You can get the PDF and scan through everything at your leisure. So tons of factoids and numbers. It's a good read. that in the criteria, there's nothing about pleasure. There's nothing about how much pleasure do you feel that you get on a regular basis. Instead, the questions are dealing with things such as, to what extent do you trust your government? To what extent do you feel that you have a strong family relationship? To what extent do you feel that if something were to go wrong, there'd be someone to take care of you? So what we see then is that really the concern is not so much about pleasure, but it's more about security. So why security? Well, if you're in a secure environment, you're more likely to fulfill your talents, your potentials. You're more likely to explore the things that are of interest to you. If your basic fundamental needs are not being met, and one of those fundamental needs is security, then you're not inclined to fulfill any of your other talents or potential. And this is something that even Plato was well concerned with. He thought that if your basic needs are not met, you can't do philosophy. You can't reflect on the meaning of reality, knowledge, aesthetic values or anything of that sort. You've got to take care of your gut. You've got to eat. You need a house. You need to have your social relations. So in looking at which countries are the most happy, in many ways, it's those countries in which people feel the most comfortable to flourish, to explore their talents, to have family relations. They feel that their government is taking care of them in those reliable ways. Okay, so that's some implications, but we have empirical data that kind of supports the points I'm attempting to make. So one question that might arise is, should we then just not be concerned with pleasure at all? Should we avoid pleasure and thinking that, no, pleasure, you're bad? Well, we have to be honest with ourselves. Pleasure is going to happen. I mean, right now, I'm experiencing quite a bit of pleasure in giving this talk. I know I'm weird, but it's happening, okay? But in large part, then, we can think of eating something that's really delicious, enjoying a good film, enjoying a great conversation, and that's what I take this to be, is a great conversation. I know I'm doing most of the talking, I'll listen pretty soon. But it's still a pleasurable activity. Why? Because it's contributing to our flourishing, to our well-being. So pleasure will certainly happen as a side effect, but we shouldn't do the thing purely just to pursue pleasure. That's where you start chasing the dragon, so to speak. One desire results in the other. When you have a pleasure that's satisfied, you're hungry for another pleasure. So I don't think that we should actively avoid it, but we shouldn't actively pursue it either. Instead, recognize pleasure is going to happen. That's just a feature of being human, but don't let us control ourselves. So this is the summary of the claims I've been trying to explore or advocate for here. First claim being, we are generally bad at being happy. That I think there's plenty of data showing that we've been getting less happy over time. And I believe that this badness is primarily the result of thinking that we should pursue pleasure as a means to becoming happy. So I think it's a misplaced method. We pursue pleasure as a means of becoming happy in large part because we don't understand what it means to actually be happy. I think that we've mistakenly thought that being happy is just feeling good. But a more fine-grained understanding of happiness indicates that pleasure is not the means to that. So by understanding happiness as an evaluation of one's own life, regardless of how you actually feel about that life, we then reimagine the relationship between pleasure and happiness. So the feeling of happiness can serve as an indicator of how your life is going. And pleasure itself may be the side effect of living a happy life, but it's neither sufficient nor necessary for living happily. Tranquil, calm might be better emotional states than being in a state of pleasure. So these are a list of resources of the books that I've used to inform this discussion. The one on the far right is by Mike Martin, a book called Meaningful Work. It's a text on professional ethics, but I've used it in past professional ethics courses in getting students to ask, well, what is it about the nature of success that they believe that they'll become happy? So by thinking about our relationships to our professions, then we can maybe be on track to have a more flourishing career. The Pursuit of Unhappiness, book by Daniel Haybron, does an excellent job in looking at how when we pursue something that we believe will make us happy, we end up being less happy. So thinking about issues such as buyer's remorse, you think that, oh, if I buy this thing, it's going to make me so happy. Then you look at your bank account. But then also think about how many things that you end up purchasing that you never even use. Tags on those clothes stay on forever, the DVDs stay in their wrappers. So what he's done here is he's collected a lot of the positive psychology empirical data to illustrate that we're really bad at judging what's going to make us happy. We end up making ourselves less happy. This is another book by Martin, who in that book argues about the relationship between happiness and the good life, advocating something for the virtue theory that I've been putting out here. And then happiness here, this is a collection of classic and contemporary readings in philosophy. So there you would be able to read Aristotle, Seneca, Mill, their writings on happiness. And then Sissela Bach here provides a nice exploration of happiness and looking at the history of the idea of happiness from Aristotle all the way up to contemporary neuroscience as well. So hopefully those are informative resources, and I'm happy to answer questions as well. So thank you for your time.
I have a question.
Great.
That slide you showed in the beginning, could you go back
Happy to.
to the suicide
The job one or the overall?
job?
Okay.
You had there at the top.
Well, I don't.
Okay, well, let's see, somebody came up with these numbers.
Yeah, this is the Center for Disease
Well,
Control.
Construction, extraction.
Yeah,
I worked in that field for 40 years,
great.
all right? I was a professional tradesman. I was a pipe fitter / pipe welder, local 1010. You said a few things I don't agree with.
Great.
Construction workers are people who think and produce and make something of value.
Absolutely.
We can interpret a plan from an engineer and make his plan a reality,
Absolutely.
right? Most of the guys I've known, they took pride and they found happiness at times in what they were able to accomplish.
Wonderful.
I know I did too. I did see a few suicides in the midst of some of my peers.
Sorry to hear that.
Yeah. But you know what? It wasn't because of the job.
Okay.
It was like everybody else in society. A bad marriage, troublesome children, a bad habit. Construction guys drink a lot, they gamble, and that caused a lot of downfalls.
But those certainly happen in
Of
all
course,
other
that's
fields.
what I'm saying.
Yeah.
It happens all across that spectrum.
Yeah.
But you know what? I don't know how they came up with that, because I'm not going to debate it either, because if it's a fact, well, it's a fact. But my experience, over many, many decades, is that a lot of construction guys, and by that I mean guys who actually produce things, make things. Now, when you look at the other part, when I used to see guys who for 30 or 40 years all they did was push a button or just stamp something, yeah, that gets pretty tough on the mind, and it does cause the depression.
No, that's perfect. I really appreciate that input. And I hope that I didn't communicate that if you go onto these fields, then automatically you're going to be at
No, I
higher
didn't
risk.
take it that way.
Okay.
But what I wanted to say was that people like in those fields, they're very unique animals, very unique men, and a lot of women. One good thing is in our union, we have equality of pay and equality of opportunity. Even though in my group I've only had one woman who quit, but I've seen other women work in other trades, and they do a wonderful job. But I wonder, as I work with people all my life, and I've helped some of these guys go through some hard times, it's just the typical problems. Some of them have no foundation of faith or values. Some of them had a very sad family life, and a lot of them had substance abuse problems.
Wonderful. No, and I really appreciate these points. And something that I think that you're alluding to is that those who are in these fields who are more likely to be well off, to have happiness, have something outside and over and beyond the job itself. Yeah, so as you said.
Money really, it's an interesting thing when we look at the discussion today in society about disparity and inequality of wealth. I wish someone would do a study, maybe you could do that. And you could look at a group of a few thousand guys where we all make the same amount of money, down to the penny. But if we look at our individual lives, we would ask ourselves, why within the diversity of race and religion is it that the outcomes are so different? So you can't really cry out and say, the man put me down, or you stole my wealth, or you had white privilege.
Sure.
It does not work because we're all making the same. So it's not exactly it's what you did with that money. Mm-hmm. And that's where it comes in with these other pleasure-seeking things that you mentioned. A guy might throw all his money into motorcycles, speedboats, or unfortunately, maybe in the slot machine.
Sure. Yeah, no, I appreciate that point, but what I think that we're in agreement a little bit more than maybe you realize is that the concern is about the degree of security that's going to contribute to their happiness. And unfortunately, in fields like construction, and I've worked construction for a while myself, that there's very little security in those types of positions.
Yeah, I can comment on that too. Within that spectrum of unionism. Yeah, I can, because I've done this all my life. My son-in-law is IBEW, Electrical Brotherhood Electrical Workers. You're right about the security. There is no security. You work, you get paid. You don't work, there's no pay. When times get tough, you might have to go overseas and work.
Or summers, or whatever, winters, whether it's
exactly. There are other people that do that kind of work that were very fortunate, that were tied into a Fortune 500 company where our security is pretty good.
So this is good. So what we need to ask then is, what can we do as a community to help reduce these numbers? Because these jobs have to be in existence. Well, but so these jobs have to be in existence. We need people to be doing all these things. So they're very important.
Right now we're booming.
Right. So what can we do to help reduce that? So I appreciate those points.
Okay.
Thanks. Yeah.
So I'm just wondering if that's, what can we do for this is self-awareness.
Mm-hmm.
It's just being more aware of who we are, what our reactions are, but that was just a response. My question is gratitude one of the virtues that sort of gets us on the right path, or where does that fall into the spectrum?
Well, so there's different lists of virtues.
I'm coming in blind, I don't know my virtues.
No, that's fine. I don't either, I'm still working on that. It's a work in progress. But for some people, gratitude certainly is. In the Jesuit tradition in particular, they go through an exercise each evening similar to Epictetus's, but it's more lengthy. It's called an examen. And one of the points in the examen is to acknowledge what you're grateful for. So in expressing gratitude to others, if it be a higher power or someone in your relationship, then that would count as a virtue as well, because in some sense, you don't want to do too much of that, then you're just groveling. But if you don't do it at all, then you're not being deferential to those that have helped you.
That's the too much or too little thing.
Yeah.
Oh.
Yeah, so Aristotle was a huge influencer on the Jesuits, actually.
Okay, Michael, thank you.
Yeah.
So how does joy play into all of this?
It's a side effect.
Is it a side effect of pleasure or happiness?
I mean, so what do you mean by joy? I might have a different meaning of it than you do.
I see joy as a greater manifestation of happiness.
Okay, so what do you mean by happiness?
Pleasure, no.
Yeah, so we might mean something different than in terms of just happiness itself. Whereas mine is really more concerned about how well is your life flourishing and developing. Whereas you seem to be talking about more about that immediate feeling. That, right now, I feel happy. And joy itself might be something that's even sweeping you up. The Greek word for joy was ecstasis, which is tied to ecstasy, which literally means to be taken out of. So to be taken out of yourself. And it's when you're taken out of yourself, then you're experiencing that ecstatic joy that's tied to something. So it's hard to be able to reflect on that. That it's not until the joy is over that you can actually say that I was in that joyful state. Whereas if you were able to say, yes, I'm feeling joy right now, then you're probably not.
So is there joy without pleasure?
Again, I think it's going to be tied to what we actually mean by pleasure itself. I think that in some of the earlier senses of it being a satisfaction of a kind of desire, if in that satisfaction of the desire there is this production of ecstasis, then sure. Yeah.
Out of curiosity, do you believe that having a better attitude about certain things like school and work, you think that has a direct influence on happiness? And if so, what is your take on what would you suggest is a good idea to help to cultivate that better attitude?
Sure. No, I think that's a great question. So the Stoics were very concerned about our attitudes and recognizing that so much of our problems are the result of having bad attitudes or not the right perspective on things. So with using something like Epictetus's dictum that we should, above all else, first recognize what's in our control and what's not, with something like school, asking ourselves, okay, can I control what the teacher does? Probably not. But what can you control? Your time management. You can control your prioritizations of when you do things as opposed to others, how much sleep you get. Those are probably things that will be more conducive to you having a better outlook to school itself, because you're not going to be suffering as much. You know, if you're feeling better, if you have better time management, if you're not as stressed, then you're going to be more relaxed in the learning process too. But then also recognize that you did make a choice to come to school. And taking ownership of that decision and asking, okay, why have I in fact come to school? And this is why I think this is a good professional ethics type question, is asking, why are you choosing this profession over others? What is the underlying assumption that you think will happen in pursuing that career? So taking ownership of the fact that you're going through the educational process that you have already chosen to take on. So recognizing the privilege that comes along with it, I think it's helpful. Does that help answer the question? Okay, great. And Mark?
What is your view on antidepressants? It seems like they can be so helpful for some people and like devastating for some other people. And even like some have said how they can limit your emotional spectrum. You're just always happy all the time.
I think that's up to the patient and the psychotherapist to resolve in thinking about, is the person's chemical makeup such that it's a complete obstacle to their capacity to flourish, such that in those circumstances they need that additional assistance. So we have to ask, is that person's current state due to environmental issues, or is it really going to be chemical? Yes, that's it.
Where does art and music fall in? Because normally we're trying to feel something when we're creating music or when we're listening to music. We're kind of pursuing the pleasure of the artwork. Where does that end up falling?
Good. So Pythagoras had argued that music is education for the soul. So he thought, so him and Plato both looked to music as educational tools. So it's not so much about pleasure that's obtained from engaging in music in particular, but it's more so of an educational opportunity that you can be listening to particular kinds of music that are sometimes challenging, boring in some cases if you're not trained to listen to that, but recognizing that's an opportunity to cultivate more patience, more appreciation, understanding. You get exposure to different cultures, attitudes, beliefs through music and art itself. Art, similarly, that's one of the key areas in philosophy is actually aesthetics, to try to understand the nature of beauty. So we can look at our experience of art as an opportunity to become educated about beauty itself. And so we can ask ourselves how to better realign our own living such that we have a more flourishing or beautiful life. So they're certainly incorporated, but maybe the intentions behind either creating art or enjoying it would be different from what most people do when they just want to consume it for pleasure purposes. Yes?
How do you correlate, or how do you compare happiness and being at peace?
Well, I think that my argument here is consistent with happiness being contentment, because when you're more content, you're not as prone to having different emotional states get in your own way. That when you're content or at peace, then you're more likely to face adversity with that sense of calmness, such that you're more likely to be successful. Great. So I think that, are we done? Or thank you for your time.